Welcome to the D.E.A.D podcast, where I discuss all things spooky and weird. I am Desi, and today I'll be talking about the Ghosts of Lancaster. Let's get started. Hey everyone, how is everyone doing tonight? Hope everyone is doing good. Tonight I'm going to be continuing with Lancaster. Last week we discussed the history and the hauntings of the Lancaster Castle. So I wanted to do some more research and I found a couple more places. So this will basically be a couple of different places in Lancaster that are said to be haunted. There's one place that has a little true crime in it. Let's get started. Okay, so the first place I'm going to be talking about is called the Three Mariners. Reported to be one of Lancaster's historic and popular pubs. This Grade II listed building dates back to the 1600s, and there are even stories of an even older pub occupying the spot before then. The pub has played a large part in Lancaster's history, from housing Jacobite soldiers to allegedly containing a secret tunnel that leads to Lancaster Castle. It's also one of the only pubs in the country to have a gravity-fed cellar with the castle rocks above keeping the beer and ale cool. In the Three Mariners, the cellar is above the pub. This means the casks need to be hefted upstairs, but it means the beer and ale flows naturally downwards. The pub is old, perhaps one of the oldest in the city. Before the name Three Mariners, it was known as the Carpenter's Arms. Both names likely derive from the pub's proximity to the River Lune and the ships, carpenters or mariners who may have visited the building since the 13th century. The pub stands on the cobbled remains of Bridge Lane, a road that would have been very busy until the new bridge was built in 1788. Even today, the pub enjoys a pleasant spot in Lancaster and is near popular tourist attractions such as Maritime Museum, the Priory, Lancaster Castle, and the Judge's Lodgings. In its 600 years history, the pub would have seen Henry VIII close the Priory, the trial of the Pendle Witches, which we talked about last week, the burning of Penny Street in 1643 during the Civil War, the imprisonment of George Fox, founder of the Quakers, in the nearby castle, the construction of Penny's Hospital, Dalton Square, the Corvell Cross, the Buck Ruxton murders, and so much more. Unfortunately for the pub, the name Three Mariners made the news in 2006 after a vicious murder in the nearby underpass. It is said that the Three Mariners is haunted. Many spirits have allegedly been sighted here. A Jacobite soldier is often seen seated by the fire and walking the lane outside, as well as three ladies who haunt the upstairs, although it is said they are very nice. This haunted building is also rather unique, in that the women's upstairs toilets are apparently particularly haunted. People have reported sudden drops in temperatures and strange noises in the cellar as well. Along with Williamson Park's Ashton Memorial, the Three Mariners was visited by the Most Haunted television program back in 2009. Okay, now the next place that we're going to be talking about is Ashton Hall. It is currently the headquarters of the Lancaster Golf Club. Ashton Hall, now used by the golf club, was originally built by Roger of Petau in the Barony of Lancaster. Only the tower at the south wing remains of this original building, which enjoys a fantastic view of the estuary of the River Lune and Morecambe Bay. The main hall was built by Edmund Lawrence. The Lawrence family controlled Ashton Hall for the best part of 200 years. Records show that John and Alice Lawrence were tenants in 1323, and also that William D. Lancaster I granted a portion of land to Gilbert during the reign of Henry II from 1154 to 1189. The old hall has seen an eventful past. At one point the manor was held by John de Couplan, who captured David, King of Scots, at the Battle of Neville's Cross. In 1436, King James I of England and Charles II have both stayed in Ashton Hall. There are a number of reports of spirits in Ashton Hall. The most common is a white lady who was locked away in one of the hall's towers while her lord husband fought abroad. When the husband returned to the hall, she was found starved to death. In 1788, the wife of the 9th Duke died, and his sorrow was so great that he ordered the doors to Ashton Hall closed. They did not open again until 1819, when he died and was taken through to them the ancient parish and priory church of Lancaster, where he was buried beside her. Paranormal experts point out that grief on this magnitude can sometimes create a haunting manifestation. Indeed, the wife of the 4th Duke of Hamilton, the lord who died in the duel against Lord Mohun and General Macartney, was said to be so upset that she spent most of her remaining 32 years at Ashton Hall in a bedroom in the south wing. The room is known as the Duchess's bedroom to this day. It is also noticeable that Ashton Hall has an unusually high ratio of female descent. Ownership of the estate has passed over the female line far more frequently than other comparable buildings. Roman remains have also been found on the site. Some of the artifacts discovered nearby have included an altar inscribed with blessings to a goddess of plenty. This may have been Ops, a mother goddess who also governed fertility and the harvest. She is celebrated in the festival of Opiconceptia on August 25th and Opalia on December 19th. Is there a connection between this nearby goddess and Ashton Hall's strong line of female descent? Okay, the next place we're going to be discussing is called the Golden Lion, which I did briefly mention it in last week's episode on the Lancaster Castle. One of Lancaster's many historic public houses, the Golden Lion sits on Moor Lane, the path prisoners used to take from Lancaster Castle up to Gallows Hill on the way to their execution. Allegedly, prisoners were allowed to stop for one final drink, including the infamous Pendle Witches. According to local legend, one prisoner refused his final drink and was hanged soon after. Had he taken a drink, however, he would have been in the pub when his pardon arrived by courier. The current building dates back to the 17th century and is reputed to be haunted by many spirits, one being a spectral nun who used to escort the condemned to Gallows Hill, as well as many spirits of the executed still looking for their final drink. Although nothing of the original building remains, the cellars here at the Golden Lion have been used for centuries, and it is believed that somewhere within the cellars is a secret entrance to the maze of smugglers' tunnels which are rumored to run all under the city. The current building dates from the late 17th century, and it is probably no surprise, considering its dark past, to those that believe in such things, that the building has supposedly acquired its fair share of ghosts that roam around and make strange sounds all over the pub, and especially in the cellars all day and night. One of these ghosts is said to be of the nun who dutifully escorted the condemned to their deaths at the gallows in the 16th century. She has been spotted wandering around the cellars, waiting for the next poor soul who requires an escort up the hill by previous landlords, landladies, and staff. She is by no means the only spooky thing going on here at the Golden Lion, though. Okay, the next is going to be about the Grand Theatre. The Lancaster Grand Theatre in Lancashire is one of Britain's oldest continuously operating theatres, having been open since 1782, opening during the reign of George III. The theatre entertained the gentry of Lancaster and surrounding areas for over 100 years. Believed to be haunted by a number of performers long since passed. Since the 1800s, there have been reports of paranormal occurrences here. Built in 1781 by Charles Edward Whitlock, a dentist, and Joseph Austen, an actor, it was known simply as the Theatre Lancaster upon its opening in June 1782. It was one of the first permanent theatres in Britain, and although there have been numerous alterations to the building in its 200 years existence, the majority of the original stone has survived. Upon its opening, it played host to plays such as Hamlet and The Belle's Stratagem, and later Macbeth, receiving plaudits from the gentry from Lancaster and Lancashire. By the 1830s, the building was less used for professional performances and more for formal lectures and meetings for the Temperance Society. In 1843, the theatre was sold to Edmund Sharp, an architect from Cheshire. He made alterations and added an extension and reopened the building in 1849 as a music hall, as well as a museum for the local Literary and Natural History Society. In 1884, the building was sold again, this time to Henry Wilkinson, who set about reopening the building as the Athenaeum Theatre. In 1897, the theatre was altered again, this time adding a new stage, designed by architect Frank Matcham. In 1908, a fire badly damaged the theatre and the work Matcham had done. Extensive work was required to restore the interior. Nevertheless, this was all replaced within a year. Designed by architect Albert Winstanley, reopening at the Grand Theatre. The theatre has a 457-seat capacity and is currently owned by the Lancaster Footlights. They started performing at the theatre in the 1920s and purchased the building in 1951 to save it from demolition. It now plays host to both professional and amateur shows, and plans are in place for several building upgrades, ensuring it's a part of Lancaster's entertainment scene for many more years to come. The hauntings of the Grand Theatre in Lancaster have been a source of intrigue to people for generations, with a number of past performers believed to reside here. This unassuming Georgian theatre admittedly doesn't look grand from the outside. However, once you step through the doors into the auditorium, you can't help but feel the anticipation of all that has gone before. One of the most common sightings is of the Grey Lady, believed to be Sarah Siddons, the sister-in-law of Charles Edward Whitlock. Sarah was a Welsh actress and was the most well-respected tragedienne of the 18th century. She was most famous for her portrayal of the Shakespearean character Lady Macbeth, a role that she made her own, and a role she performed at the Grand Theatre in Lancaster in 1795. Sarah has been witnessed on many occasions, sitting in the stalls, passing in front of the auditorium, or walking across the stage. Actors, staff, and visitors have all made reports of being watched from the stalls, but nobody is ever found. as well as Sarah, a former male actor known as Harold, is believed to haunt the theater. His spirit has been picked up by investigators on numerous occasions. The backstage area and dressing rooms have a reputation for making people feel very uncomfortable, with several people forced to leave the area, and some refusing to even go back there at all. Disembodied footsteps are often heard in the area, as well as the stage. It'll take a brave soul to carry out a lone vigil in one of the dressing rooms, where past investigations have resulted in people being touched in response to their questions. Okay, so this last one has to do with 2 Dalton Square. Home to Lancaster's Town Hall, the borough pub and offices, not many people are aware of the grisly events that took place at 2 Dalton Square in 1935. Home to Lancaster's Town Hall, the borough pub, and offices, not many people are aware of the grisly events that took place at 2 Dalton Square in 1935. The house was home to Dr. Buck Ruxton, which also doubled as his operating room. Buck was well liked in the community and very well respected as a family doctor, even occasionally waiving the fees of patients who couldn't afford to pay. Dr. Buck Ruxton was an Indian-born British physician who was convicted and hanged in 1936 for the murders of his common-law wife, Isabella Ruxton, and their housemaid, Mary Jane Rogerson. The gruesome murders took place at the family home at No. 2 Dalton Square in Lancaster, England. However, the bodies of Isabella and Mary were not discovered in Lancaster, but over 100 miles away near the town of Moffat in Scotland. On the morning of September 26, 1935, a local woman looked over the parapet of an old stone bridge around 2 miles north of the Dumfriesshire town of Moffat. Upon the banks of the stream she spotted a bundle wrapped in fabric that had lodged against a boulder, with a partially decomposed human arm protruding from the package. Police were called to the scene, and officers searched the stream, surrounding ravines, and the nearby river, discovering 2 human heads and 4 further bundles, each containing extensively mutilated human remains, including thigh bones, legs, sections of flesh, and a human torso and pelvis. These human remains were in an advanced state of decomposition and had been wrapped in bed sheets, a pillowcase, children's clothing, and several newspapers. On October 1st, 1935, the remains were examined at Moffat Mortuary by the forensic scientist called John Glaister, Jr., and a doctor named Gilbert Millar. Both men determined that 70 separate sections of human remains discovered were those of 2 females of notably different heights and ages, and that the mutilation conducted on the remains had been committed by an individual with extensive anatomical knowledge in an obvious effort to prevent or complicate identification of the victims. In addition to the extensive mutilation across both victims' entire bodies, which both Professor Glaister and Dr. Millar deduced had been entirely committed with a surgical knife, as opposed to either a saw or an axe. The murderer had also removed the eyes, ears, skin, lips, soft tissue, and several teeth from both heads to make identification by dental records impossible. Given the proximity of where the remains had been found, to such a major arterial road, detectives from Glasgow established that the remains were likely to be those of local individuals and began to consider the possibility the perpetrator had traveled to Scotland to dispose of the remains. It was discovered that some of the newspaper pages that the body parts had been wrapped in were from the Sunday Graphic and had been a souvenir edition of the newspaper which had been printed and circulated solely in the Morecambe and Lancaster area of England on September 15, 1935. This strongly suggested that the two victims and/or their murderer lived in the northwest of England. Scotland Yard were called in to assist the Chief Constable of Dumfriesshire. They focused their efforts on recent missing persons reports filed within the north-west of England on or shortly after September 15, 1935. 5 days before the discovery of the human remains in Moffat, Ruxton had visited Lancaster police, claiming his wife had once again deserted him. He also visited the household of the parents of the family maid, Mary Jane Rogerson, who lived in Morecambe, claiming their daughter, having recently engaged in an affair with a local youth, had become pregnant, and that his wife had agreed to discreetly take her away from their home to arrange an abortion. As abortions were at the time illegal in Britain, Ruxton had urged the Rogersons not to contact the police. Following his visit, the Rogersons visited Ruxton at his practice. On the occasion, he attempted to placate their fears for Mary Jane's safety by claiming both she and his wife had broken into his safe and stolen money before eloping from his household. Despite Ruxton's insistence on this occasion that his wife and Mary Jane would almost certainly return once they had spent the money, the fact Ruxton had now given a different explanation as to why his wife and their daughter were missing from his household aroused their suspicions. The following day, they filed a missing persons report with Morecambe Police. On October 9th, Scottish police visited the Rogerson household and asked Mary Jane's parents if they were able to identify any sections of clothing in which the bodies had been wrapped. Mrs. Rogerson immediately recognized a blouse with distinct patchwork repair beneath one armpit as having belonged to her daughter, whom they had last seen on Saturday, September 14th. Conversing with his Lancashire counterpart, the Chief Constable of Dumfriesshire discovered that Mary Jane's employer, Ruxton, had informally reported his wife missing the previous month, and that the final confirmed sighting of Isabella alive by anyone other than Ruxton himself had been on the evening of September 14th, when she had left her two sisters in Blackpool to return to her Lancaster home, having travelled to the seaside resort to view the Blackpool illuminations. The same day that police identified several items of clothing used to wrap the dismembered remains, Ruxton again visited the Lancaster police station. On this occasion, he burst into tears, complaining that local rumors had begun to circulate regarding the discoveries of the human remains in Scotland as being those of his wife and maid, and that these rumors were proving to be detrimental to both his medical practice and his general reputation. Lancaster police had by this stage spoken to one of the Ruxton's two charladies, who confirmed to the officers that on September 15th Ruxton had arrived at her home and informed her that it was unnecessary for her to work at his premises until the following day, and that when she had arrived at 2 Dalton Square the following day, the house had been in a general state of shambles, with carpets removed, a pile of burned fabric-like material in the garden, and the bathtub extensively stained with a yellowish discoloration. Dr. Ruxton's neighbor told Lancaster police that Dr. Ruxin had asked them to extensively clean his house in preparation for redecoration, explaining that he was unable to do it so himself as he had badly cut his hand opening a tin of fruit several days earlier. He had also given them several stained carpets and a suit, saying they could keep them if they washed them. On the evening of October 12, 1935, Ruxton was arrested by Lancaster police and extensively questioned throughout the night. In this interview, Ruxton denied he had ever been to Scotland after having established his Lancaster practice. However, he was unable to explain why his car registration number had been logged by a young cyclist who he had knocked over in Kendal on September 17th. Police believed that the incident had occurred as Ruxton had been driving en route to Lancaster from Moffat, something he denied. Ruxton was further unable to explain why a police search of his home revealed extensive traces of bloodstains on the stairs, railings, and various carpets within the property, despite evidence of the house being extensively cleaned, and several walls around the staircase being recently redecorated. Moreover, he was also unable to explain why traces of human fat and body tissue had been discovered within the drains of the property, with much of this material recovered within the section of the drains leading directly from the bathroom. After further forensic investigation confirmed that the remains found there were those of Mary Jean Rogerson and Isabella Ruxton, Dr. Buck Ruxton was formally charged with their murders. On March 2, 1936, the trial of Dr. Buck Ruxton opened at Manchester's High Court of Justice. The trial lasted 11 days. The prosecutors at Ruxton's trial contended that Ruxton, inflamed by jealousy and paranoia, had murdered Isabella Ruxton and Mary Jean Rogerson in the family household. They surmised that Mary Jean Rogerson was a witness to the murder of Mrs. Ruxton, and that is why she was killed. Mrs. Ruxton had received violent blows in the face and was then strangled. The evidence suggests that her death and that of Mary took place outside the maid's bedroom, on the landing at the top of the stairs, because from that point down the staircase right into the bathroom there were found to be trails of enormous quantities of blood. The suggestion was that when Isabella went to bed, a violent quarrel took place, and Ruxton beat and strangled his wife. Mary Jean Rogerson caught him in the act, so she had to die also. Mary's skull was fractured. She had some blows on the top of her head, which would render her unconscious, and she was then killed by some other means, thought to be a knife. It was then believed that Ruxton dismembered their bodies in the bath before traveling more than 100 miles from Lancaster to dispose of the body parts in the stream near Moffat in Scotland. Ruxton's defense counsel based their defense upon their contention that the bodies had been misidentified and that the two bodies were not those of Isabella Ruxton and Mary Jean Rogerson, but of two other unknown individuals, and that, as such, the evidence presented to the jury was flawed. The defense further contended the bloodstains found upon the suit and carpeting Ruxton had given to his neighbors and located within his home the following arrest had been innocently accrued throughout the years Ruxton had operated his medical practice from the house. Ruxton was found guilty of the murders of Mary Jean Rogerson and Isabella Ruxton and was hanged on the morning of May 12, 1936. The murders became known as the bodies under the bridge, a reference to the location where the victims were found, or the Jigsaw murders due to the efforts undertaken to reassemble the victims and trace where the murders had taken place. Dr. Ruxton was nicknamed the Savage Surgeon. on account of the savagery and mutilation inflicted on his victims. The prosecution of Dr. Ruxton would prove to be one of the United Kingdom's most publicized legal cases of the 1930s. The case itself is primarily remembered for the innovative forensic techniques employed to identify the victims who had been dismembered and to prove that their murders had been committed within the Ruxton household, miles away from where the bodies had been found. The house where the gruesome murders took place still exists today. Number 2, Dalton Square, Lancaster. The building remained empty and in disrepair for nearly 50 years until it was subdivided and turned into offices, but the outside of the house remains relatively untouched, with local rumors of hauntings and its horrific history putting off any potential buyers. There have been many reports over the years of curtains and blinds in the windows moving on their own, and the ghostly apparition of a woman stood in one of the upper windows has also been cited. One local rumor being that the blood stains can still be seen in the bath. This is unlikely since the house was gutted and renovated back in the 1980s. Or that the ghost of Isabella and Mary had been spotted around Dalton Square. This building was also part Most Haunted's 2009 visit to Lancaster. The gruesome tale was even immortalized into a playground song. Red stains on the carpet, red stains on the knife. Oh, Dr. Buck Ruxton, you murdered your wife. Then Mary she saw you, you thought she would tell, so Dr. Buck Ruxton, you killed her as well. So that is the end of the episode. Let me know what y'all think. Have you been to any of these places? Have you heard of any of these ghosts? That brings me to the end of this episode. Thanks for listening to the D.E.A.D podcast. Please follow me on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at the D.E.A.D podcast. Also, feel free to send in your stories, episode suggestions, or feedback at the deadpodcast1@gmail.com or send me a DM on Instagram. If you enjoyed this show, please rate and review the podcast on whatever platform you are listening on, and be sure to come back next week for my next episode.